you have the conditions that you created or you allowed. So what are you going to do to improve this and help your team perform, particularly when you're in a company where you can't just go get the imagined fantasy ideal employee?
What would happen if we just told the truth?
Welcome to TruthWorks, where we dig into the nitty-gritty of leadership and work.
And what needs to change? I'm Jessica Neal.
And I'm Patty McCord.
Our journey together started in HR, but trust us, it's evolved into something wild, honest, and, well, a bit rebellious.
So throw out the handbook. We're here to redefine rules to work for us, not against us.
Let's dive into another episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of TruthWorks. I'm Jessica Neal, and I'm here with my co-host, Patty McCord.
Hello there.
And today we have a special guest. His name is Christian Muntean. He's the author of the book. It's out now, Train to Lead. He's a master coach, and he's a certified exit planning advisor, which I hadn't heard of, but I want to know all about that. Before we get into it all, tell us about you and how you got started in all of this. Like, how does one become a certified exit coach?
Or a certified leadership coach or whatever.
How'd you do this?
All right. Well, I came into this world sideways. So I guess you could say I was breech birthed into my career.
Okay.
No, not literally. But I started out, so over 20 years ago, I used to be involved in international disaster relief and community development. I worked in various places in Africa, worked in the Middle East, worked in the Balkans, Indonesia, Latin America. And I started to notice that I could be in a secure environment in a very well-funded or even in overfunded projects, which can happen. And we would have a difficult time succeeding if we weren't led well or if the team didn't get along well. And then I also noticed we could be in an active conflict zone in an underfunded project and get an enormous amount of work done and be really successful and have high morale and enjoy the job if we were led well and our team got along well. And so I thought the work we were doing, I thought it was important, too important to leave it to chance of somebody getting promoted to leadership and then not being effective in that role.
Yeah.
But what happened is I came out of those experiences thinking I really want to understand leadership because that seems to be the crux thing. And even in the communities we were working in, it was a leadership question about whether or not, or why the issue was so bad. Even in a natural disaster, if it really was chronic, if it created a massive problem, you could always tie it back to some leadership decision that was made somewhere. I just began to believe that if I can help leaders be more successful, then hopefully the ideal would be then more of these issues would be able to be resolved. I started learning a lot of tips and tricks, especially working in insecure environments. We had to learn how to go into a community quickly, engage stakeholders quickly, engage the leaders quickly, and have a clear understanding of what kind of help would be helpful. And you didn't have a lot of time. You couldn't spend 6 or 8 months doing surveys or studies. You had to be able to jump in and jump out. And I thought I discovered something that I could apply these tools to organizations, and this would be a brand new thing. Turns out there's a whole field of organizational development in that space. So I discovered that sideways, but I started to be asked to do this and eventually realized I could make a living out of it. So this is what I've been doing for over 20 years.
I was just kind of thinking as you were talking, here you are in sort of a crisis, a disaster, natural disaster. I'm thinking about like the fires in California of recent and how crucial leadership and teams are, not just at work, but everywhere. You know, when you looked at these disasters, the common thread that would come back to would be like decisions leaders made on sort of how well these things went or didn't.
Right.
And Patty and I are so fascinated by the leadership journey, right? Because we know, and we learned this at Netflix, that if we wanted to be a great company, we had to have the best leaders, hands down. And not just the best, like, functionally or technically, right? Or from their craft, like the best holistic leaders.
Yes.
That got how to navigate inspiration, vision, development, to being able to work through a conflict and crisis and things. So I think that's just so fascinating that here you are in this whole different world that I have not been a part of, but the same application is the same because it's a working environment.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. It's all the same at the core in the sense of organizing people, aligning people towards common focuses.
Let's talk about the nature-nurture part of leadership, right? Like, are some people just born leaders? If so, do they have a leg up? Or can you take any individual contributor who's really good at what they do and turn them into? What say you, Christian?
A lot of people ask that question, and I think it helps if we have some kind of working definition of leadership just so that we can answer it. And so if I define leadership as the ability to influence or align behavior towards a common purpose, I think that even a newborn child is pretty effective at aligning their parents, in a common purpose. So there's a certain amount of leadership that children exercise over parents. I have 3 kids, and, I like to think I was teaching them, but it's a race, from the beginning about who's in charge.
Yeah.
And so I think the ability to lead is mostly learned. I would put that as high as like a 98%. Now there's traits, personality traits. If somebody's more extroverted or introverted, if somebody's more charismatic or less, how much those things are all learned or you're born with. But a lot of my background's in athletics and sports, and I based this book, Train to Lead, out of the fact that you could take any athlete and create a training regimen that will have them peak out precisely before their event. It might be 3 months away, but you know how to peak them out. And I thought, why isn't leadership that almost all leadership development is like, here, go to a workshop, go through a training, here's some books to read, now don't screw up. I mean, that's your typical path.
Yeah.
And I thought, why do we do that? This is too important. There's too much on the line for most organizations to promote and to lead that way or to build leaders that way. So using that fitness analogy, anybody really can become more fit. Doesn't mean anybody can become an Olympic athlete. So the difference between Olympic athletes and everything else, you get that little bit of genetics. But any Olympic athlete is going to tell you how hard they work and how focused they are, and that they have special training and coaching. And I think that accounts for the majority of what gets those folks there. And I think it's similar for leaders.
When I worked with Reed Hastings, who was our CEO at Netflix back at the beginning, we wanted to write down not a Bible for everybody else to use, but we wanted to write down what are our principles? What do we believe in? How do we think a successful organization should work? I was like, how about it's like ballet? You work really hard and you train really hard. And then when you get on stage, it looks effortless. He's like, yeah, no, nobody's going to relate to ballet. So when we got to the professional sports team metaphor, it was really interesting. And so I kept thinking about it. I've thought about it now for 30 years, right?
Okay.
Here's what I love about it. What I love about it is it's prescribed. It's focused on winning. It's focused on getting the best out of each individual as part of the team. Team goals are very, very clear. And typically great athletic coaches are very honest. Right. I'm going to say to you, oh, dude, you are not fast enough.
Right.
You have got to get faster in order to stay on this team. And if you don't, you get cut. You're like, okay, got it. Right. I mean, for whatever reason. So there's that logic about it. But I also think that without that spark that comes from being on a great team, you can't be a great team. Right. So it's your new season. Right. You're in a new season. You've got new competitors. How does the coach leader figure out who's the right team to be playing?
I think one example, and I'm going to back up just a little bit, is especially in today's hiring market, you don't always have this ability of this hyper-selected pool of people to pull from. So by the time people are being drafted into professional teams, they've already been through various screening and filtering processes, so you tend to have this already pretty elite group of people. And right now, I would say most of the hiring market doesn't have that. You're working with who's willing to show up, and that's a challenge. I mean, you talk about being real. I used to joke around hiring managers taking on people who have the most mild felony, and now they nod their heads like, yep, That's kind of where we're at, for certain jobs and certain professions. Years ago, and you're both from an HR background, so even just maybe 6 or 7 years ago, frequently there was articles about software and approaches for filtering through applicants quickly.
Yeah.
And you don't see that anymore. Now it's, where did everybody go? I mean, for most industries, most spaces. So at least that's what my clients are experiencing. So I think the bigger challenge now is, how do you build an ideal team that can perform at a very, very high level with the best people you can get, but it's the people you can get. Fortunately, there's a lot of really good research around that actually points to the fact that the highest performing teams doesn't necessarily come from the highest performing group of individual contributors. It comes from being able to really create environments where there's sufficient trust on the team, where people can be honest with each other and have open dialogue and open conflict that still maintains respect. So, and there's some other elements, but if you start to get some of those things in place, then you can take people who may otherwise be, average or okay, and produce high performance out of them. And that requires leadership, though.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, I think, and Patty and I have seen this, like that, when you have a great leader on all the dimensions that we were talking about before, people follow that person. They want to work with that person. That person builds an open environment where there can be trust and there is respect, because they treat people like that. And then the people on the team treat each other that way. And then to your earlier point, like in working through conflict, they work through conflict much easier because they have all of that stuff. They have the foundation. And it's fascinating to me, kind of what you're talking about before too, not to take you back to your disaster days, but that's high stakes, and luckily at regular work, the stakes aren't as high. Right. But here you were in situations where you worked through those things better because you had better leaders. And then because you had better leaders, you had better teams, and you guys were making better decisions and had more trust. It's just fascinating to me that it is the same for everything you're working through.
It's the same thing. Yeah. And the question that I got to was, well, what makes something better? Or how does a leader become better? Because there's often sort of a fixed mindset approach that this person just is a better leader and this person isn't.
Right.
I mean, this is true for most businesses. It was also true in the disaster relief space. You didn't have a massive group of people to work from or pull from. And if you had somebody that wasn't performing well, you couldn't just go out and hire someone. There was nobody there. So you had to be able to learn how to get performance out of the people that you're with. And that was a big driver for me in writing this book. Was there are just reams and reams, I mean, just tons and tons of books and podcasts and videos on leadership. It's not a new concept. It's not a new topic. But what I think is lacking is a clear step-by-step path for how do you become a better or an improved leader. So if I want to become better than I am right now, and I know that I've just been promoted to SVP or VP, or I'm a frontline supervisor or whatever, and I'm going to step into that role, how do I ensure, or is there anything I can do, and I would say there is, how do I make sure that I'm better than I was in 90 days? How do I keep that continual improvement? And that's what I wanted to do.
Let's unpack that.
And I love, and one of the concepts that you have that I totally love is that this is just a surprise, particularly to people promoted from within. Okay, now your job is to get other people to do their job.
Right.
With a smile on their face and a song in their heart. That's how I used to tell people. I'm like, it doesn't really matter anymore how good you are. And by the way, if they suck, it's your fault.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What do you have to wrap your head around first, second, third to get to that place?
What you just described is absolutely true. I mean, most people are very technically proficient or they're good at sales. And those are the two major pathways into a leadership role.
Yep.
And being technically proficient at engineering or at management, project management, or in a medical space, or whatever your thing is, it's not that none of those skills will translate, but fewer translate than you might hope.
Yep.
And when you get there, it's a different job. And now your job is to improve the performance of the group. Typically, you got there because you were individually performing well and could carry some responsibility. And so oftentimes you see, the Peter principle where people get promoted to their level of incompetence. That starts to emerge oftentimes in management because it's a different job. So where I begin the book is I follow, not to get too nerdy or deep in this, but
We like nerdy.
You like nerdy? All right,
Yeah,
awesome.
nerdy.
I'll deep dive in. So when you're training somebody, an athlete, probably the most commonly used approach is called periodization. And so the idea is you start out with, looking at somebody's nutrition and how they eat and how they sleep and all of those things. That's just basic for any kind of training. Then you look at basic conditioning, which is how do you prepare the body for stress. Then you start preparing somebody for actually the athletic work, which is a foundation of strength. So you focus on strength training for a short period of time, and then you shift to power, or being able to exercise strength quickly, and then you start shifting to endurance, and then you start getting into mobility in a recovery phase, and then you cycle. And so the idea isn't that you just focus on strength training for forever. At some point, you need to focus on translating this to other things, because otherwise you overdevelop in some areas and you're underdeveloped in others. Also, people just burn out. They max out in certain areas, and they just they start getting diminished returns. But if you cycle, and you've got a programmed cycle, you can grow. So the idea, as applied to leadership, starting with the basics of nutrition and sleep and those kinds of concepts, some of that's literally applied to leadership. Make sure you're sleeping well, make sure you're eating well. But the other part of it is looking at what are the healthy inputs that are coming into your life. What podcasts do you listen to? What books do you read? What news do you absorb? What people are you around? Tons of research around this topic. One of my favorite is the Framingham Heart Study, which is one of the longest longitudinal studies ever. I think it was started back in around World War II. And they wanted to look at heart health in a town, Framingham, Massachusetts, I believe. And they just started studying collectively a large group of people, the whole community, to see what impacted heart health. They basically sucked up so much data in that study, they realized they were discovering other things along the way. So now they've been studying that same community for 70 years, and they've been able to see generational changes and so on. And what they found is very clear correlations between who you know, who you spend time with, and whether you're likely to use tobacco, whether you're likely to be obese or not, these other health factors. Other studies show that and translate that to other kind of behaviors as well, that, when it comes to wealth, when it comes to other factors, who you know, and who they know actually has an impact as well. So people you've never met impact you. So what I tried to bring to the attention of leaders or people who are growing into leadership is you need to curate the influences in your life, and you need to remove the toxic ones, the ones that, you wake up in the morning, you get in the news, you're angry before you've even gotten out of bed. You need to take that stuff out, and you need to bring in positive influences. This doesn't mean Pollyanna. You have to face the actual planet that you're operating in, but you do need to curate and make sure you're bringing in healthy influences and you're minimizing or removing the toxic ones. So that's the beginning.
Yeah, I love that. But, I don't think a lot of people talk about that.
No, and if you don't do it, you're stuck. Because right from the very beginning, you just start reacting to, or the degree to which we're influenced. I like to think of myself as a super independent person that has, cuts his own path and all those things. But the reality is I'm not as much as I would like to be. And I'm influenced by what's around me. And so I have to be careful. And most people aren't really thinking about that. And they find themselves either stuck in habits they don't want to be in, or acting in ways they don't want to, or finding it harder to grow in particular ways.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going back to the sports analogy. It's not an accident that even individual performers tend to train with other people. Even individual performers will have coaches and will have people that they're working with, because they realize, even if they're not thinking it all the way through, but just having other people who have a similar level of drive or knowledge on a topic helps their performance improve.
Yeah, and I think for leaders and teams, sometimes this gets manifested early on when you first get promoted in the 80-20 rule of spending 80% of your time on your lowest performer.
Right.
Where it's like the savior well,
myth,
right?
I mean, that if you get into that where, you're starting to try to be a rescuer for somebody, but being aware that, to kind of take it to the next level is being aware that now you are an influencer on others.
That's right.
How do you appropriately, with healthy boundaries, how do you appropriately place yourself into someone's life and influence them?
So give us some tips. Yeah.
In regards to what? Like what kind of a situation?
Well, like, okay, so organizations do this all the time, and I want to know what your thoughts are. So they promote, just as we were talking about, they promote so-and-so to manager because they're a great engineer, they're a great marketer, they're a great salesperson.
Or a great presenter.
Great presenter, what have you. They say, okay, now you're a leader, go lead. And now they're supposed to hire people, they're supposed to develop people, they're supposed to fire people, they're supposed to come up with strategic plans and goals. And the organization doesn't do anything to really teach them how to do these things. Some companies have some learning and development and training, but they don't really move the needle all that much. I always thought about my biggest challenge when I was the CHRO at Netflix was if I could make my leaders significantly better, that is going to make the organization better, right?
Yes.
Because they're going to hire better people, they're going to make better decisions, they're going to be faster, all of the things. And my sort of belief, and this is something that Reed and a bunch of us like discussed at large, but like if we could better the person, we would better the leader.
Absolutely.
Right. And so it was all about like not, taking them sort of out of the day-to-day business and getting them to think on more of sort of like an ethics kind of perspective, a social perspective.
Yep.
But, you've become a leader, and there's a lot, obviously, that you're talking about that you could do on your own, which I want to get some tips for leaders that have just been promoted. But also, what do organizations do on this? Like, what are you seeing?
What do they do, or what should they do?
Yeah, or what should
What
they
should
do?
they do? And what are they doing that's not working?
Well, most of what I see right now is literally, at most, they're sent to a conference or they're sent to some kind of a executive leadership program, which often these things are full of really excellent content. The problem is, and going back to like physiology, there's certain nutritional supplements that you might take, and some of those are what we would call bioavailable. In other words, when you take it, your body absorbs it and can use it. And then others, you just spend $60 on the little thing of vitamins, and you take it, and it just passes straight through your body. And it's not bioavailable. And what I realized is most of what we make available to leaders is not bioavailable. You take it in. By the end of the workshop, you've forgotten the things that you learned in the first 2/3 of the workshop. You can't even mentally retain 8 hours a day of content. You walk out of it, and it's like, wow, that was amazing. That was great. I was challenged. But I still don't know how to talk to that employee who's wrestling with that performance issue. Or I learned a tool, and I'm going to use the tool because it's the one I know, but it may or may not be the tool that employee needs from me.
Yeah.
I like what you were saying, Jessica, is I think before you get all of that, because for a leader to learn all of these tools, like how do you do strategy and how do you deal with confrontation and how do you negotiate and how do you, all of these different tools or skills that you learn, before that and more fundamental to that, how do you become the kind of person who's able to lead effectively, even if you're not sure how to exercise the tool? Because ultimately, at the very core, this gets into what sounds like fuzzy bunny type stuff, but it's really the core of it, which is leadership is a relationship. It never exists outside of relationships.
Yeah.
And people who know how to navigate relationships well are self-aware. They have some level of personal health, and they know how to interact, dynamically, relationally, or socially with other people. And if you build those competencies and you help people understand those core competencies, things like strategic planning can either be brought in through a consultant or you can learn enough of it to work with it. Same thing for many of those tools. They're become easier to learn. When I do executive coaching, and I've been doing this for many years, very rarely am I working with somebody who exercised a leadership skill inadequately. It's not often that we're dealing with, well, here's how you could have or should have handled that negotiation, or here's where your strategic planning process went sideways. That's just like you skipped a step in the process. That stuff comes up, but it's rare. What usually comes up is somebody's dealing with fear, they're dealing with anxiety, they're dealing with issues related to their identity in the sense of, if somebody gets promoted and now they have to make everyone else succeed and it's not them, like, who am I then in that case? And or I thought I need to be the person with all of the answers, and I don't have all of the answers, and how do I deal with that? It's those internal wrestles. So you guys know this, I'm sure, but when you meet a high-level executive who on the outside, it's like, wow, there's articles written about this person, they're asked to speak, they've considered someone who's won it, they've figured it out. When you meet and talk to the person, they're still wrestling with this stuff.
Yep.
Not that they're insecure and have a hard time navigating life. They're not. They're high performers. But when they struggle with something, it's rarely, 12 steps or 10 steps to strategic planning. That's not the thing. It's usually issues that they have with healthy boundaries, issues that they have with confronting well or over-confronting and belittling somebody, or managing anger, or how do they manage stress? And now their stress behaviors are coming out in ways that are unproductive. And those are the dynamics. It's an actual person of the leader. So I focused the book, Train to Lead. The first, I would say, half of the book is really about how do you build yourself up to become the kind of person who can lead well. And then I get into some leadership skills that are, I think, broadly applicable in most leadership positions.
So let's talk about the first part, because I was thinking about my executive coaching career, and I think about how many times you've probably done this too, where I've walked in with a leader of that nature, highly regarded, blah 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 blah, and the first thing they tell me is they blame their team. These people that report to me, they're just idiots. They're not very good. I'm like, good God, like, did you miss Leadership 101? Like, they're your team. Right. Yeah. So give us some of those really practical first principle things.
So if I was working with somebody like that, if I'm brought to somebody who's immediately blaming their team, I've usually been sent to work with that person. They didn't usually seek
Go
me
fix
out.
them. Yeah.
So it's a different kind of a client. And in that case, usually this is like super behind the scenes, but my actual client is whoever hired me to fix that person. And so I have a conversation with both of them about what realistically we're working on and what we're trying to accomplish. You're talking about an understanding of the core function of the job, what leadership means, and the ability to take ownership and responsibility, which they're not doing. They may not be aware of that, and they may not even be in a culture that supports that or does that either. So I need to have those kind of contexts, which usually you can pick up on very quickly if you understand what you're doing. But in that, what I would do is basically have a come to Jesus conversation where basically this is your job, is people. And either you accept that. And I was coaching someone who was going to be a successor for a company, and it was a very similar scenario. He's like, what, would people want me to run around and kiss babies all the time? Like, what's my job here? Like, I'm supposed to be making money.
I'm supposed to be nice.
Yeah, it was almost that way. And I said, yes, your job now is
smile
people.
on their face and a song in their heart.
So your job now is to get the best out of people and to work with that. And if you don't accept that, then you need to acknowledge that now, because you're going to struggle for the rest of your career in that space or not be in it very long. So that was probably my first or second conversation with him, is really just to hold up the mirror and say, this is what you look like right now. Over there is what's needed to be successful in this role. You need to choose. You don't have to be accountable to me, but I'm just letting you know kind of where this path goes. And if you don't care about people and you don't want to grow your people, or you're not going to take ownership for where your people are at, then you've given up all control. Whenever I start blaming other people for what's going on, I have also by default given up control.
That is such a big message, because often I find the people that use that excuse are the people that want to control everything. And the reason why their subordinates aren't good enough is because they don't do it like me. Right.
The trust, and there's a lot of different kind of dynamics in it. But when I mean control, I don't mean like controlling other people. I mean my ability to change the outcomes of a larger situation. And I like I don't know who coined this, but I like the idea that for leaders, you have the conditions that you either created or you allowed. And when you just accept that, okay, I either created this or allowed this to happen.
Right.
So what am I going to do about it? What are the levers that I have to pull? And the very first and closest levers to you are how I relate and think and how I choose to see the world. So I have a client that I'm working with right now who has a tendency to think his staff are stupid. And he has a tendency to be a very black or white thinker. And he has a tendency to think in absolutes. So part of what I have to be able to do is help him to see, this is a very limited perspective of reality. Also, he sees himself, or he really aspires to be a very effective leader. So I see that part of his heart where he really wants to do it well. But there's this other side of him that's learned to think in absolutes, and if you want to get into it, there's like this trauma-informed background and alcoholism and stuff like that, like to get into the nitty-gritty of the reality of life. And he's a recovering guy, and so he understands some of those things. But the degree that I can get him to just own, I need to produce this. And so, I was talking with them the other day, and I just reminded him, you have the conditions that you created or you allowed. So what are you going to do to improve this and help your team perform, particularly when you're in a company where you can't just go get the imagined fantasy ideal employee.
Right.
I love that because we used to talk about this term at Netflix all the time, context, not control. And I remember going to Reed one day and I was bitching about all the people on my team and they're just messing up and blah, 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 blah. And he said to me, he's like, well, you know whose fault that is? And I said, yeah, theirs. And he's like, no, yours. And I was like, what? And that changed me as a leader forever, because when I really thought about it, he's like, yeah, they're failing because you failed to set the right context for the team, and that's on you. And so whenever things weren't going the way that I wanted them to go, I never looked at them first. I looked at me first. And I think that is just a very, very important thing for leaders to learn.
Yeah. And I think the way you frame that is important. It's not that our employees aren't responsible for their performance and for the way they relate and all of those things. They do carry responsibility. But I absolutely agree with you that we need to look first at what context, to use the language you're using, what context have we created here, and to what degree have we created or allowed this scenario? And is there something we can change in that first? And what I have found that the vast majority of the time, there's things that we can do that begins to change downstream outcomes for everyone else. At times, you do, and part of context is maintaining healthy boundaries, having clear expectations and accountability, and being willing to go talk to people. So it's not all about putting a smile on a face and a song in a heart. Is often easier to do in a workplace where people know everyone's doing what they're supposed to do. Not everything is, everybody can just show up and do whatever they feel like that day. That rarely makes people happy.
Agreed. So I want to get back to organizations, because, like we talked about, like they're sending people to these conferences, all well-intended, and there's maybe a nugget or something that somebody walks away with, but they're not moving the needle really on making their leaders better. So what is it that you advise organizations to do at a holistic level that helps improve leadership?
At a very holistic level, I think the senior executive team really needs to commit to their own personal leadership journey. And then just by them doing that, it'll begin to create a culture where this becomes normative. And they'll just naturally start talking about it. They'll just naturally start bringing those concepts into the workplace. So that's probably the easiest and simplest place, is for the core executive team.
Yeah. And you can't be it if you can't see it, right? I mean, that's the thing, is that I've found that the most effective training tool for leadership is great leadership.
Yeah.
Right.
And it goes back to that idea of context and who you're around, and understanding that if I want my team to be able to handle irate customers well, but I'm frustrated and impatient with my team, it doesn't matter how many trainings I send them through or the protocol or the scripts that I give them. That attitude's going to come through. And so I really need to learn, how do I manage my own impatience? How do I wrestle with where's that coming from and why is that there? And I think that's kind of at the very simple, most basic level. I had a Fortune 100 company call me once, and they had this unnamed, I think it was somebody in their HR office that said, hey, we've got this unnamed behavior that's a problem throughout the, 30-some thousand employees that they had. Are you able to come in and help with it?
Can you fix that?
The unknown monster under the bed.
Yeah.
And they said, basically, we want you to do trainings across the company. So, I'm a solo consultant. So for something like that, for a lot of consultants, that's like a big thing because you're going to be honestly milking that cow for a long time.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And right, to be really blunt about it.
Yep.
And I said, but really, if you want to actually solve this, is this behavior manifested in the executive team? Like, do they portray this? I guessed it would be if it was a company-wide problem.
Of course.
And I said, yeah. And I said, okay. And the board, does the board also demonstrate this behavior? And she said, yes, they do. And I said, here's the thing, is I need to be working with the board and the executive team. If they change that behavior, then mostly we're just doing some cleanup downstream. And as opposed to me doing trainings across the company that everybody will hate coming to, and it's going to cost you a ton.
Right, right. Training goes 5 levels down and says you're empowered to, make your thoughts known and change your environment. But you're not.
But you're not.
Yeah. And the other thing I think, particularly in those kind of situations, is to look holistically at all the systems that are associated with that. So, for example, are those the kind of people that you promote, right? Because like hires like, right? So it's like, you know what? I think we should give Kristen the job because, he's forceful and he says what he means. And, he tells them to step up and do their best. And that's the way it ought to be, right? So the waterfall system doesn't work, but the be what you see system is absolutely true.
It's funny because I was just talking to a company today, and this well-intending CHRO, she's transforming the company. And I said, okay, well, how involved is the CEO? They care, but I was like, well, it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So you are going to work your butt off.
Yeah.
You're going to send out all of these really beautiful emails and slides and docs, and you're going to have lots of sessions. But I'm going to tell you, a year from now, the same thing's going to be happening. Unless it happens up here, it's not going to happen down there.
Yeah. And I think if there's a takeaway for a listener from this episode, if they're a leader, if senior leader, I actually don't take clients if I'm not working with the senior leadership.
Yeah.
Just because I ethically decided I'm not going to provide services that I don't think have a very high chance of producing results. I don't need that as part of how people talk about me. I don't need to make the short-term contract and have done a paper check, a box checking exercise. I'm not interested in that. I got sucked into that stuff earlier in my career and realized I hated it. Everyone hated it. It wasn't fun.
Because it doesn't work.
And it doesn't work. And so I think if someone's listening and they're a leader and they want something improved in their organization, going back to what we were saying, like start with yourself first.
Yep.
And then even if that doesn't automatically improve everything, it'll start to set the context or conditions where all of these improvements become easier to do. Because particularly if there's a values or a priority issue, which there almost always is in that, you want to make sure that things are aligned from the very top to the bottom. And if you're trying to align the organization, but you've got the head of the organization that's kind of, off in some way, the rest of the organization is going to move to come into alignment under the head, which is off in some way. And you're going to be working against yourself. And so as a consultant, I just don't do that anymore.
Well,
I love that.
I think it applies to, like Jessica and I have in our careers done a lot of startup work, right? So this is really important work that we do with early in their career CEOs, right?
Yeah.
But I also think it's applicable to everyone who gets promoted. It was all particularly from an individual contributor perspective. Yes, you're right. You're here because it was all about you. Now it's all about them, which is actually all about you.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you didn't get out of it. And it's just a new skill set. And I mean, I think the other thing I heard us all say was it's not an innate trait necessarily to be a leader. And you can train to be a better leader.
Yeah.
It's your job to lead forever.
Yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't stop. Even if you wanted to.
If you wanted to. By the way, the culture is your job
Yeah.
Forever.
Forever.
And I think that's such a huge lesson because so many leaders work, so, especially if you're talking about startups or entrepreneurs, they work so hard to build this thing.
Yeah.
And then they finally get it, and they finally get to that place where it's easier. And they're
Yeah.
like, I did it.
Yeah, right.
You know, some of the risk is gone. It's still, there's always risk, but there's like that, am I going to survive? We're past that now.
Right.
Now we're thriving in some way. And there's a huge tendency to want to just take your foot off the gas and coast and just enjoy the fun stuff and not have to go and do the hard leadership work that's still sometimes needed.
Yeah, because scale's going to just happen naturally.
Yeah. And I think that leadership is a perishable skill in the sense that if you don't regularly practice these things, you start to not know how to do them. And many entrepreneurs forget this about themselves because 20 years ago, they did fight their way up and they built their thing. Then for the last 15 years, they've been doing something else. But in their mind, they still have this identity of this scrappy entrepreneur, but they haven't lived that way. And they've forgotten how to do that. And they don't even always recognize it when they see it again in some of their people that are around them. It becomes a struggle. So I think you have to keep practicing and keep learning.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I want to end on this point, like, because I love the fact of thinking about it like an athlete and conditioning yourself, right? Like you as a leader have to condition yourself. You have to work at it. You have to work hard. And it's forever. You can't. And when you take your foot off the gas, that's when things are gonna slide in a way that you don't want them to.
And I want to make that sound good, though.
Yeah,
it is forever. But just like staying healthy isn't awful.
Right.
I'm in my 50s now, and so like I'm grateful that I've had a lifetime of putting in the effort because it makes it better now. You know, I'm not struggling as much with peers that are dealing with health issues.
Yeah.
Continuing to practice your craft of leadership isn't an onerous burden. It's just staying alert and staying in it.
Will you join us in a career confession?
I would be happy to, I think.
No, you'll like this one.
It's fun.
One of my highest performing core team members is leaving for a higher role elsewhere, and I don't know how to replace them. I'm torn between hiring someone completely new or promoting someone else up through the company. Is it better to hire someone that comes with the experience and fresh energy, or take a chance on someone that could grow with the role?
Put me on the hot seat.
Yeah, you're on the hot
well,
seat.
I think I'm going to give the classic consulting answer of it depends. And so, I mean, you can get good results both ways or poor results both ways. I would say I would begin with having very clear expectations about what you want that person to produce for you. So the clearer your expectations are about the outcomes and the trajectory for them to onboard. Like if it's a role where you need them to be at 100% immediately, you need to bring someone in who has that competency level. Because hoping to train somebody up if they're not there yet is just going to set them up for failure.
Yep.
On the other hand, if it's like, well, we need them to be up at full speed within 18 months, and so I have time to mentor them and support them to get up there, oftentimes an internal hire, because they already understand the culture, they're a known quantity, is usually more effective. And a lot of, at least executive succession planning, which is what I'm most familiar with, internal hires are often more successful in the role, assuming they have certain support. Overall succession planning, executive succession planning, has a very super high failure rate, so it's usually not done well. But when it is, it's because people do prepare, and they really realize it takes people a while to get up to speed. And if they're internal, there's a few things that you don't have to teach because they already understand the culture and so on. But I would be very clear about not what are the inputs this person's supposed to do, but what are the outcomes they're supposed to produce. And do they have the ability to do that?
And you said my most important message, which is timing.
Yeah.
It's all about the timing, right? And then if you can do that, if you can reverse engineer that as a leader, either a hiring manager or somebody that's going to promote somebody, particularly in the internal promotions, love them, be a huge fan, right? But the best thing you can do is say, look, it's risky for both of us.
Yeah.
Here's what the organization's going to want to need. And we're going to stay really closely, but That's what's going to have to happen from someone. And I'm going to do everything I can do to help you be that person.
Yeah.
But, it's the accountant who wants to be the CFO. It's like, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
You can absolutely do that. Next Thursday is probably not your day.
The language I use is to set up gates that they have to get through. Thinking like skiing. But the idea is, in that, if that accountant wants to grow, then I would say, okay, these are the 5 competencies that we want to see you work through. Let's start out with this one.
Yep.
And give you a chance to succeed and to practice leading teams or to practice running meetings. Then we're going to go to this next one. And as you work your way through the gates, we can start looking at moving you into higher levels of responsibility.
Yeah.
Some variant of that where it's a clear plan, but also you want to give people exposure to, if it's a job that they imagine it, which for executive positions, most people, what they imagine and what they experience are not the same thing.
Yeah, right.
Even the CFO to the CEO.
Yep.
They're working with the CEO regularly. They see them every day. What they think it's like to be a CEO is usually wrong.
Yeah.
And when they get there, they're like, oh my goodness, what is this?
Yeah.
And I think...
This isn't
And
precise.
they're not
Helping-
happy. Yeah, and they're not happy doing that kind
Right.
of stuff.
So I like to try to give people enough exposure to the job, if you have time to do this, where they can get a taste for it and decide if that taste is good or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
I
the
love that.
ideal scenario is for somebody to self-select out for the right reasons and to recognize, you know what, I'm a great CFO or I'm a great controller. I don't really want to be dealing with those things, if that's appropriate.
Yeah,
Not
hiring and
like
firing.
Not a
100
confidence-related
people.
issue.
Yeah.
Christian, this was so fun.
Yeah, it's good to talk to both of you.
Yes.
It's a great
okay,
conversation.
where can our listeners find out more about you and the book, Train to Lead?
Yeah, the best way to reach me or to get my stuff, I have a lot of free content, is to go at christianmuntean.com. The book, you can get access to it there, but also Amazon or Barnes & Noble or anywhere that you buy books.
Yay.
Yay.
Well, thank you
Thank
so much.
you.
I learned a ton. This was so fun.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to TruthWorks. This episode was produced by Megan Hayward. Thank you to Kathleen Speckert and the whole Edit Audio team.